This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. If you want to support this show and become a member of the Unregistered community, go to unregisteredlisteners.com. Supporting members get access to our private Facebook group, and they also receive discounts on Renegade University courses and merchandise, as well as signed copies of my Renegade History of the United States. Again, to support this show and to join the smartest, most interesting community on the internet, go to unregisteredlisteners.com. I am in the home of Robbie Martin, documentary filmmaker and journalist, and the maker of a multi-part documentary film called A Very Heavy Agenda, which is about a topic that I have great interest in. It's about the neoconservatives, or the so-called neoconservatives, and their influence on American foreign policy over the last, couple of decades, really. And I wanted to say, first of all, Robbie and I we have an interest in foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy. We have an interest in the neoconservative movement. But I am here mostly because we are both fans of a historian who's not named Thaddeus Russell. We're both sort of obsessed with this guy named Robert Kagan, who's actually an American historian who's sort of the star of your film, right, Robbie? He's there throughout. He begins the film. I think he ends it, and he's kind of the main character, isn't he? Just tell us, why do you care about Robert Kagan?
So I guess I got obsessed with him first learning that he was the co-founder of the Project for New American Century with Bill Kristol, and just having never really heard his name before. I mean, there's a much longer backstory than this, but I'll just start with this, that I got into him because I didn't know who he was. I saw his name around a lot, and I started checking out clips of him on C-SPAN, and his interview with Brian Lamb on C-SPAN immediately made me realize that he is hyper intelligent compared to the rest of the neocons that I had heard talk before. Bill Kristol is already sort of a pariah at that point. He was kind of mocked. He was kind of a joke, I guess. But something about Kagan really stood out to me as being just this powerful intellectual who was able to, I guess, massage the typical sort of imperialist rhetoric about why America has this destiny into a way that actually made sense. And seemed to, I could tell by listening to it and watching it that it was probably widely influential to people who normally would not be swayed by that kind of rhetoric from a typical neocon. And I think that that's what fascinated me and also disturbed me about seeing him, was that he was very, very effective. And part of what interested me was that I started to go into my own head about, maybe he's right about this or this. And I started, I could see how someone, I guess, with not very much historical context or not very much knowledge about what the neocons' agenda was could actually get sucked into believing everything he's saying.
Right. So let's talk about who Kagan or Robert Kagan is and the Kagan family. It's not just him. There's a bunch of Kagans, all very important.
Yeah.
So lay it out. Tell us about the Kagan family.
Well, this was something that I had no idea about until, I actually started working on this documentary film. Robert Kagan is one of the most influential, one of the sort of more known Kagans, but his sibling, Fred Kagan, I learned later is actually credited for being instrumental in creating the Iraq War surge and not just the Iraq war surge, but also the Afghanistan surge under the Obama administration. And then I realized that that Robert Kagan was married to Victoria Nuland, who held a very important position in the Obama administration, it turned out, especially in his second term, of serving as the Assistant Secretary of State for Eurasian Affairs. And she was, there were some things that came out about her in Ukraine that I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar with, where she was on tape, seemingly playing musical chairs with the Ukrainian opposition leaders. She said, "Fuck the EU" on tape. So when I realized that family connection, I was like, oh, that's really fascinating that this neoconservative legacy from the Bush administration, that's this thread that has continued directly into the Obama administration. And then you actually unpack more of the Kagan family, and you find that Kimberly Kagan, Robert Kagan's sister-in-law, who's married to his brother Fred, is actually the CEO and the founder of a think tank in D.C. that is entirely about war. It's not just a normal foreign policy think tank where it's like, what are we going to do in this country? We're going to do in this country. It's actually dedicated to war. It's called the Institute for the Study of War. And this think tank is largely...
promotion of it.
Yes. And it's largely funded by pretty much only defense contractors.
Oh, wow.
Which is not unusual in DC think tanks, but in terms of if you look at all their donors, there's really almost no one else besides defense contractors except for like Palantir.
Right.
Other think tanks are, it's kind of a spattering mixture of defense contractors, other weird philanthropy groups and things like that. But this is kind of straight up defense contracting. And also her personality, like once I started watching videos of her personality really fascinated me. And I guess in some kind of weird twisted way, I started to almost like fall in love with this family. They were endearing to me.
Me too.
In a certain way where it's like, wow, this family has so much sway over Washington D.C. and then really as a effect of that, the world kind of, and they're completely unknown. We hear about all these other political dynasty families like the Clintons. What's another one? Let's say the Bushes.
The Kennedys.
The Kennedys.
The Roosevelts.
Exactly. Right. But you never hear that there's this other family in D.C. who's only sort of known within the policy wonk circle, but is highly, highly influential to a point which is kind of hard to believe unless you really see it all. I mean, so that's why my documentary is sort of good for making people understand how influential this one single family is. Yeah. And then there's Donald Kagan. Who's
dad, right?
The father, the patriarch of the family. He's kind of like the Emperor Palpatine of the family. He has been basically a well-respected, very influential historian in the United States for decades, and he's written textbooks that have been distributed to many, many colleges. I have one upstairs if you want to check it out. And his whole thing is really interesting because he sort of warps and distorts the lens of history to fit into sort of a Robert Kagan idea of, why imperialism is essentially okay. And additional to that, this is something that Jonathan Swartz has pointed out, who writes for The Intercept, that a lot of Don Kagan's historical writings sort of are in the framework of the Old Testament being historical, which is interesting for like an intellectual, well-respected history professor. And he's sort of gotten away with that, which is sort of surprising. But this is a theme that's come up over and over again in his writings.
Wow. The Old Testament. Tell me again, what that has to do with anything here?
I think it mostly has to do with his views on Israel and the Middle East.
Okay.
So, believing that essentially the Jews have the right to the land of Israel. And that's sort of a foundational for a lot of his history teachings.
And Zionism is at the core of, I think, pretty much every neoconservative's ideology, I would think. There's no neocon I know of who isn't a huge supporter of Israel, right? And
exactly, yeah.
And orients much of their thinking around American foreign policy around Israel and its needs.
Absolutely. And that is something that I've grappled with this because I feel that early anti-imperialists and even sort of libertarian foreign policy people did a disservice to this kind of neocon argument by making it all about this idea of dual loyalties. Right. That the neocons, some of them had dual citizenship. So this must mean that they're actually representing Israel. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of almost like a coup d'etat, like a foreign coup of our foreign policy. And I cannot honestly understand part of that argument, but that's not how I've come to see it over the years. I've sort of almost come to see it more as Israel represents something very special to neocons. And perhaps I'm sure Zionism has fueled into that, perhaps even their own Judaism in some cases. But I think that more often than not, it is that Israel was this tiny country that did things so out of the realm of international law for so long and got away with it, that the neocons thought that that was sort of something that they wanted to achieve as well. Mm-hmm. They wanted to be able to get away with the same things, extrajudicial, just for one example, extrajudicial assassinations, defining people as enemy combatants, things like that. And just, Israel had been waging a quote unquote war on terror for I don't know how many decades before our government coined that term. So there is kind of a line you can draw between sort of the Likudnik or the way, the Israeli hawks dealt with terrorists or the way the Bush era neoconservatives did.
So I have a theory about why the neocons are so attached to Israel, or how that came about. So as a lot of people know, the neocons, people like the Crystals and the Podoritzes and the Kagans, they started off, actually I don't know about the Kagans, but I know the Podoritzes and the Crystals started off as left-wingers, as Marxists, in fact, in New York City, growing up in the 1930s and 1940s and 1950s. And Norman Podhoretz, at that time, was kind of the leading intellectual of the movement, he and Irving Kristol. But I think Podhoretz was always a bit smarter, more of an intellectual, and a better writer, certainly. And he wrote a very important essay, a famous essay called Our Negro Problem in 1960s. I think it was early 1960s, in Commentary, which was the Neocon magazine, in which he described being beaten up by black kids in his Brooklyn neighborhood in Brownsville, and how that was a formative turning point in his life, and how he started to move toward Judaism because he was singled out as the Jewish kid who could get beaten up. He had a target on his back. This was during the time when Brownsville was being, in the demographics of it were changing from a Jewish neighborhood to a largely black neighborhood.
Yeah.
And he was terrorized by these kids in the 1940s when he was when he was growing up there. And I think, and you see like right after that, he and the neocons move against black radical politics, against the Black Panthers, who were aligning themselves with who? The PLO, by the way, in the 1960s.
Okay.
And, this is sort of speculative on my part, but I think I'm right. They developed like sort of a deep, abiding dislike, you could even say hatred of, I'm not going to say African Americans, but of African American politics. But more importantly, I think they felt isolated and vulnerable as Jews in these neighborhoods, as kids. And they felt like their enemies were people of color, because they actually were. And then on top of that, these people of color, in the form of Black Panthers at least, were literally aligning themselves with the enemies of Israel, the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization. So, I think that there's something there as to why, because these were all sort of atheist, secular, basically, non-practicing Jews, right? And then they became super Jewish and became very Zionist. But anyway, that's one thing I'll just put on your lap. You can think about it for later. My crush on Robert Kagan comes from the fact that he has written what I think is the best book on the history of American foreign policy I've ever read. And I say that as a professional historian who's been working on a book about the history of American foreign policy for close to 10 years now. His book called A Dangerous Nation, which is about the first 100 years of the United States and its foreign policy during that time, I think makes the argument convincingly that American policy leaders from the very beginning, from before the founding, were imperialist to the core. Franklin, Washington, Jefferson, Adams, to a man, said the United States is destined to take over the world, to replace not just Rome, but also Britain as the great empire of the world. And they were saying that all along. And the Civil War, Kagan, I think correctly, positions it or describes it as a war of conquest and a war of the expansion of an empire. Not only that, of regime change and nation building. Mm-hmm. It was the first Afghanistan. The South was the first Afghanistan. Now, almost everybody supports the Union cause in the Civil War now because it was supposedly to eradicate slavery. But it's very important to understand that it was seen as an imperialist project by the leaders of the Union side. Lincoln and the Republicans saw the South as a future America, and they wanted to remake it just the way that the neocons want to remake Iraq and Afghanistan and the Middle East now. That was Kagan's argument. It's a really radical argument, but I think it's convincing in this book, A Dangerous Nation, Now, of course, he wrote that book in part to justify the Iraq War and sort of foreign imperialism generally by saying, look, this is as American as apple pie.
Yeah.
U.S. expansion and imperialism is always been in our DNA as a nation. And people have said, oh, no. The neocons are these weirdos. You know, as long as we get rid of them, we'll no longer have these wars of choice, et cetera. But I think that's wrong. I think the neocons are actually, they're very representative of the American foreign policy elite over the last 300 years, not just 200 years, but even before the founding. All the guys, and they were guys, who ended up founding the country and running it, again, to a man, were for the expansion and creation of an American empire globally. So that's why I think Kagan, it's funny, like, even though my politics are the exact opposite, right? I'm an anti-imperialist, but the analysis, I think, is dead right. That the United States has always been, since its founding, an imperialist idea.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think probably the main place of divergence with me and Kagan on that is that he's making the argument that it's okay and that it's normal.
Oh, yeah.
And there's an interesting aspect to what you're describing where I think that this is something we're encountering again in the Trump era. And I don't want to get too distracted with this, but the whole idea of sort of rebranding something that's always been there, but maybe not obvious to the American public in a positive light, like rebranding something that's normally considered bad and wrong, you know, about the United States in a positive light. And I kind of see a similar thing happening now with this whole notion of the deep state, or these, you know, like intelligence officials for over 2 years leaking things on Trump, you know, trying to undermine or delegitimize his presidency, where it's almost like, it seems like they're almost trying to rationalize or put a positive spin on the idea that, yeah, this is real and we want you to be okay with this. It's a strange thing that Kagan has done that, and I don't know if other people have quite done it in the same way as he has. And I think it's likely that he has also studied like classic anti-imperialist writings as well. Like he studied Chomsky. He studied, I wouldn't even be surprised if he's like popped open William Blum's book, which kind of parallels Kagan's book in a way, but it's of course taking the opposite, you know, perspective on it, that this is all really wrong and it needs to be stopped. The book Killing Hope, which kind of tries to catalog every, you know, horrific foreign policy adventure we've been on since the 1800s. It doesn't span as broadly as the Kagan book, but it's kind of making the similar argument.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, Kagan is making the similar argument as have many leftist anti-war people and libertarian anti-war people. Yeah, which is that this country is fundamentally imperialist and always has been, right?
Yeah.
It's funny. I mean, so your movie does a really good job, I think, of showing how bipartisan the neocons have been, right? And you do a lot of work on the Clintons and the Obama administration. You show how the neocons had places. Well, Victoria Nuland was in the State Department under Obama. Yeah. And the Clintons were very close to the Kagans. Robert Kagan was Hillary Clinton's foreign policy advisor during the last campaign, right? Yeah. And probably would have had a place in her cabinet.
Well, Robert Kagan even met with Obama personally, you know, several times early in his presidency. Bill Kristol as well.
So the neocons, I mean, do you agree with me on this? The neocons are not anomalous. They're actually consistent with American history.
Yes, I think to a certain extent, I would agree with that. The only difference I see with other representatives or emissaries of sort of this imperialist mindset is I think that perhaps the difference I see now with like post-Irving Kristol neocons is that I see them almost like as canaries in the coal mine. They throw things out there to see how much they can push the envelope. So it's not just that they're representatives of sort of this foreign policy ideology. They're also trying to inch things forward in all these different areas. And I think that especially Kagan has been very good at doing that. Like, for example, even just the idea of sending offensive weapons to Ukraine during 2014, 2015, it just seems like such a crazy idea on paper that to me that, you know, and I don't know exactly how that occurred, but it seems like something that the neocons were really largely behind and somehow got the rest of the establishment to get on board with it. And I kind of see that as like a canary in the coal mine kind of moment where it's like, let's see how hot we can make this situation and see what we can get away with. And that's, you know, kind of what they got away with.
Do you see neoconservatism as a conspiracy?
You know, I'm the wrong person to ask.
No, you're exactly the right person.
I do. I guess I do.
Yes, it is.
here's the weird
Of course
thing.
it is.
I mean, there are times when I've actually wondered, if some of these people, I mean, we already have one, I guess, classic example of Irving Kristol writing for Encounter magazine, which was a very influential intellectual magazine for liberals at the time. This magazine was discovered to have been funded by front group of the CIA. And Irving Kristol, of course, till the day he died, denied any knowledge of that. But I find that very interesting because sometimes I do wonder if there is some kind of, shadowy group funding some of these people beyond just the defense contractors. That's where my mind goes. So I don't know if that quite answers your question, if I think it's a conspiracy, but there is something so Machiavellian and so evil about the way that some of these people behave that I don't know. I mean, my mind does go to some conspiratorial areas sometimes, for sure. Well,
let's talk about some Machiavellian moments in the history of neoconservatism.
Sure.
So you do another great job. It's right in the opening minutes, I think, of your film in the first part. You talk about the Anthrax scare, which immediately came after 9/11, which I had totally forgotten about. And I had kind of shelved away as unimportant until I saw your film. Tell us again about sort of the infamous Anthrax scare or attacks after 9/11 and how Kagan and company were involved or may have been involved.
Yeah, I mean
they were involved, definitely, at least in some ways.
Yeah, so the weird thing is, so while I was making the documentary, I can't take credit for a lot of the like sort of in terms of original research. Like I was definitely largely dependent on a lot of great neocon researchers like Jim Loeb, people like that. Even Robert Perry. I mean, he did some great stuff tracking the Kagans, even throughout the 80s. But one of the pieces that I discovered while doing my documentary was this obscure clip on 9/12, the day after 9/11, where Donald Kagan and his son Fred went on a radio station, and they seem to be actually taking the response to 9/11 far beyond what the Bush administration was talking about at the time. What was most shocking to me in the clip was that they wanted to actually send ground troops into Palestinian territories to quote unquote clean it out and depose Arafat.
This is the day after 9/11?
Day after 9/11.
They're thinking of this already.
Yeah.
Wow.
And the guy's like, well, what about bin Laden? Didn't he do this? And they were just like, well, even if he did do it, it doesn't matter. Like if he did or didn't do it, we should just attack all these groups anyways because they want to kill us. And then at the end of the clip, I guess this is really sort of creeped me out, where Donald Kagan says, this attack, we're lucky that it wasn't much worse. What would have happened if these terrorists had anthrax on this plane?
Oh my God.
And I was just like, I honestly thought a lot of these clips I had watched late at night, I would fall asleep during them, 3-hour-long C-SPAN interviews. This was one of those clips where I thought I had honestly dreamt it until I woke up in the morning. I was like, was that a dream? Did I really find a clip of Donald Kagan mentioning anthrax before the anthrax attacks? And it was real. So that's kind of a sidetracking what you actually wanted to talk about, which is the actual attacks. But I had already done a documentary about the anthrax attacks based on a series of pieces Glenn Greenwald had written for Salon about 3 or 4 years earlier. And what Glenn Greenwald really perfectly lays out in his series is that it wasn't the WMD's propaganda, this sort of anomalous talking point that we hear now. It was much more specific than that. Iraq war propaganda was piggybacking directly on a real actual incident that was happening here that involved anthrax, biological weapon at the time. And he lays out a convincing case in that series that the culprit that the FBI pinned the attack on was just a convenient culprit to pin the attack on. He commits suicide before charges could even be leveled on him. But what I found in making a very heavy agenda and just doing more research on anthrax is that there are so many suspicious things leading up to the attack, and so much. I don't know what I could say here without sounding too insane, but there is just a lot of seeming foreknowledge about that this attack was coming before it came. A lot of the the foreknowledge and the different incidents that sort of led up to the anthrax attacks involve a lot of these key instrumental neocons like Paul Wolfowitz, like James Woolsey, a former CIA director. And even oddly, Rudy Giuliani, some name pops up quite a lot in this. He actually made a few $1 million off of an anthrax cleanup company that he had in 2004. And there's so many. I mean, it's such a big rabbit hole. But basically, this attack killed 5 people. They believed it to be weaponized anthrax, which typically means it's when you sort of have it in powdered form, it flies into the air almost like powdered sugar, like smoke, like if you open an envelope of it. So it's highly dangerous. You can breathe it in extremely easily. Most of the people who died likely did breathe it in. And I think it was something like over 26 other people were hospitalized and treated for anthrax infection. So we don't even really know how many people got it and recovered without determining what it was. But at least 25 people, 30 people were contracted with anthrax. Only 5 died, but there's just there are so many bizarre things about it. Like I'm even having trouble knowing where to start because it's just such a big.
So when the anthrax attacks are happening, and this is what the movie does really well, and I completely forgot this. Kagan and the other neocons are talking a lot about it.
Yeah,
and what are they saying?
Oh, they're saying that it is absolutely the work of Saddam Hussein.
Yeah, this is when Iraq came into the conversation.
Arguably it had already come into the conversation on 9/11 or the day of from a few neocons already. So James Woolsey and Paul Bremer were already throwing Iraq into the mix within the first few days after 9/11.
Right.
But you're right that when the anthrax attack happened, because keep in mind this is on October 5th, so it was like 9/11 was still super fresh. Everyone was still traumatized. It wasn't over yet. The neocons pounced on it and essentially wanted to make the world believe that this was the work of Saddam Hussein while it was still happening. The attack spanned over maybe the time period of a whole month. And they really, I think, influenced the larger sort of culture and other media people into carrying over this narrative. So I sort of see a lot of these neocons at the time as sort of like they're at the top of some kind of like intellectual circuit, and their writings would influence a lot of other sort of reporters who were more just, generic reporters who would sort of take their lead. And they were determined to tie Saddam to that attack. Of course, later it was determined that it was from inside the U.S. government, the anthrax.
Right.
And it turns out, obviously, Saddam Hussein did not have any known anthrax supplies. But there's an interesting clip I also found while working on a very heavy agenda where Paul Wolfowitz being interviewed at Harvard or something, and he's asked, what do you have to say about the WMD, the idea that there were no WMDs found, and how do you sort of, reconcile that now? And he really nakedly and kind of candidly is like, look, like it wasn't the yellow cake, it wasn't like that stuff that really bothered us. It was we were really determined to go after him for the anthrax. Like that to the Bush administration and a candid admission, it was really all about the anthrax. I think, looking back on it, I believe that they already knew that the yellow cake, the aluminum tubes thing was going to explode right away. Like they didn't really, they were kind of, trying to spike it and make it even more sensational, but I don't feel like they believed that was really going to stick. I think ultimately they knew kind of in the back of their minds, well, there's a real attack happening here. People are dying from anthrax. We just have to kind of insinuate that Saddam Hussein has anthrax and kind of the case closed,
Yeah.
I mean, the fear is such a powerful thing that they really didn't have to spell it out literally. And then, of course, in 2003, when Colin Powell held up the vial of the fake anthrax at the UN speech.
Yep.
And what's interesting about that is I helped Abby conduct an interview with Lawrence Wilkerson, who wrote that speech for Colin Powell. And there was a very weird moment in the interview where he gets kind of flustered and sort of weirded out when Abby brings up the fact that it was discovered that the anthrax came from a domestic source and why he chose to lean on that so hard in the speech. And I feel like I need to follow up with Wilkerson on that because it's still a strange moment where he kind of doesn't seem to understand that it for sure came from a domestic source. He still seems to believe it came from the Middle East or something.
Right. Just for people who don't know, Abby is your sister, Abby Martin,
yes,
who's very prominent in the movie as well and is also a journalist and a filmmaker. The term weapons of mass destruction came into public discourse during the anthrax scare. I remembered from watching your movie, I've forgotten that was the link. That's how WMDs came into the public discourse, which became, of course, the main casus belli, right? That became the major rationalization or justification for the Iraq War. And that was just in the weeks right after 9/11. I completely forgot this, during the Anthrax scare.
Yeah.
If he has anthrax, it was said, then he must have weapons of mass destruction. He must have, I guess, missiles full of anthrax, I suppose, was what they were threatening, right?
Even Bill Clinton in 98, there's clips of him saying that Saddam could send a Scud missile tipped with anthrax.
That's right.
I mean, this is like a trope.
Yeah.
They've been going around forever. And it's interesting you say that there's an author, I think he's German, named Philip Saracen, who wrote actually one of the best books ever on the anthrax attacks. And he tackles it from the angle of the media propaganda, sort of like the fear, the climate of fear surrounding it. And he makes the argument at the very beginning of the book that the WMDs was just a metonym. It was like a different word for anthrax. They did it deliberately so they wouldn't have to say anthrax, but that's what it meant whenever they were saying it, because people were dying of anthrax,
right?
At the time. I looking back on that, I think the Bush administration was way more clever about the way they went about that than people actually give them credit for. Huh. I don't think, the general narrative about it now is that they cherry-picked intelligence. I think it was way more calculated than that.
How so?
Well, I think that they, without making the argument that they had anything to do with the attacks, I believe they knew that the ongoing anthrax attacks was their way into Iraq. That was the way in, essentially. And I believe that cleverness sort of comes out of the fact that they didn't publicly say that Saddam Hussein sent anthrax. Nobody from the Bush administration came out and said that. And I think that was very deliberate.
But they did suggest it, didn't they? Didn't they? I think you have clips of either Kagan or Crystal saying something along those lines.
They suggested it, but they weren't in the Bush administration.
Gotcha, right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So that what was interesting to me is I believe the Bush administration was directly coordinating with the neocons on the outside who were putting out things to put in the rest of the puzzle pieces for the American public.
They were just in think tanks. No Kagan has ever held public office, right? No one named Kagan.
Not officially.
Spouses have.
The closest that's ever come to happening was when Fred Kagan and Kimberly Kagan worked under Petraeus, but they didn't take pay, and they were not officially there. Right. They were just sort of, we're not really here. We're just sort of...
But they pretty much, basically, they've always been outside, or at least they've been in think tanks.
Yes.
One could say they've been on the inside in think tanks, but certainly they've never held public office, basically.
Correct.
Certainly not elected office.
Yeah. And I believe that aspect of the Bush administration's propaganda rollout was deliberate. I believe that it was not just the 17 PNAC members that ended up in the administration. It was...
Spell that out. PNAC is?
The Project for the New American Century.
Which was the big neocon, or it was the neocon organization.
It's kind of the most infamous one, yeah.
Which released this report in 2000, right? Called
2000, Rebuilding America's Defenses.
Which I used to teach in my classes at Columbia and Barnard. Yeah. Which calls for the radical buildup of the U.S. military and calls for the establishment of constabulary military units across the world, essentially a new imperialism.
Yeah.
And it's pretty unabashed. And this is a year before 9/11 even happens. And in that document, it also says the American people will never go for this program unless there is some, what did they say? Some
catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor.
Like a new Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
And this is just before 9/11. Yeah. So it's pretty, when I used to end my lectures with that, the students would gasp.
Yeah.
And that led a lot of them into what now is called trutherism, because they believe that, if the neocons were thinking that way before 9/11, then why couldn't they have been behind 9/11? I mean, they certainly had all the motivation in the world for 9/11 to happen. This was the greatest thing for them ever. And this is indisputable. Now, let's go back to the anthrax thing. So we didn't find out about who did the anthrax attacks until 2008. Is that right? The FBI or whoever investigated
who allegedly did them, yeah. But before that, there was the FBI tried to pin it on a former Fort Detrick scientist named Stephen Hatfill. He ended up suing, I don't know if it was the Justice Department as a whole, but he ended up suing the federal government, and he won something like $6 million in a settlement as a result of it.
Why did they try to pin it on him, do you think?
That's an interesting question. I mean, there does seem to be some things about him that are suspicious as well, like I will acknowledge. One of them is that he wrote a fictional novel about a bioterror attack involving like Iraq and anthrax before the attacks. And then there was another interesting incident where a Egyptian scientist, I can't recall his name at the moment, was actually accused of being a bioterrorist with an anonymous letter sent to Fort Detrick's lab a week before the attacks. So that's interesting as well. And the person who sent that letter is a guy named Philip Zach, who's also pretty suspicious.
Okay. But the guy who's been fingered anyway,
Yes.
or was officially fingered in 2008, allegedly killed himself.
Yes.
Just before he was arrested, I guess.
Bruce Ivins, yes.
His name was Bruce Ivins, and he worked where?
For Fort Detrick, Maryland, bioweapons research lab.
And is that a government?
Yeah, it's a military facility.
That's a U.S. military facility. So he was an employee of the U.S. government.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Now, Robbie Martin, are you suggesting that the Anthrax attack was part of a conspiracy directed by the neoconservatives to push us into war with Iraq?
I absolutely am suggesting that, yes.
Okay. So they had something to do with it, you think?
I believe they did, yeah. And
okay.
This is something that will probably forever remain opaque. There's been, I would argue, and I can make a very convincing argument that a lot of it's been covered up and evidence has been destroyed, and we'll probably never really figure it out. There was an interesting incident where a drone intelligence operator named Matt DeHart, he went to jail for some. It's a weird charge. Basically, he was implicated in like sexting minors online, teenage boys, which is sort of weird that he was targeted for that in the first place. That's a whole nother incident to discuss. But basically, this guy reached out to me, his family reached out to me and said, our son was given a cache of documents by an FBI whistleblower who this FBI whistleblower was convinced that the CIA was behind the Anthrax attacks. And he made a very convincing argument, but he will not release these documents. Apparently, they're on some kind of thumb drive somewhere. I don't really know the full story, but there has been enough evidence sort of that it's piled up over time that the Anthrax actually came from Battelle. It was privately, manufactured by a CIA contractor.
What's Battelle?
It's a private company that does a lot of like scientific work for the government. And other journalists have sort of come to the same conclusion since then. And even Marcy Wheeler, who's kind of gone full Russiagate recently, she was pretty much convinced that this was the case as well, that the CIA and that these documents were completely legit.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Now, again, the motivation's there for the neocons, right? But
Sure.
would these professors, which is mostly what they are, right? Kagan's a professor, Wolfowitz is a professor, their dads are professors. Would people like that actually kill civilians, right? That's what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Knowingly kill civilians, willingly kill civilians in the service of this greater cause?
Yeah, I mean, that's calling someone an outright murderer. It's kind of like asking the question, would Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton sign a death warrant for somebody to be assassinated,
right.
for exposing Pizzagate or something like that. But, I mean, I honestly can't say that. I think some of them. Like, I would say, like, if I was going to guess,
which one?
I would say Michael Ledeen would strangle somebody to death.
He's pretty hardcore.
I would say maybe Paul Wolfowitz, maybe Elliot Abrams wouldn't have a problem snuffing somebody out.
Maybe it's John Podhoretz getting revenge for his dad getting beaten up by those black kids back in Brooklyn in the 1940s.
There's definitely an element of rage with some of them, but to answer your question more specifically, I do think there is an element of, and this is something that I've grappled with for a long time, and it definitely veers into the realm of conspiratorial thinking, but that part of what they do is they are asking. So, for example, rebuilding America's defenses. I've sort of come around to the belief that they were asking for that.
For
a new
what?
Pearl Harbor.
Oh, yeah, sure.
They were asking for it. Now, what that necessarily means can mean a lot of different things.
Well, they were wishing for it.
Yeah,
Is that what
wishing
yes.
for it.
Yes, certainly.
But I also believe they were asking some kind of anomalous, call it the deep state, ruling faction of the ruling class. I'm not sure, but I believe they were asking for it, and they were sort of making a plea in that document.
Yeah. Someone please fly some airplanes into our buildings.
Exactly.
or do something like that. I mean,
yeah.
There's no doubt, and I said this at the time to my classes at Columbia, I said, yes, there's no question that they were fully motivated for this to happen. Whether they did it or not, I don't know, but they certainly were motivated. It served the neocons' purposes very well, 9/11. But you don't think the neocons are anomalous, and it sounds like you think that they're true believers, too. If they're willing to kill people, Robert, right? That sounds like you believe that they really believe in this stuff in their heart.
Yeah, I mean, well, it depends on what you mean by this stuff. So there's certain aspects of them I think at times they're true believers, and other times I think they're being completely insincere, and they're actually using humanitarianism as just an acceptable framing device for their sort of imperialistic agenda. But I do think at the heart of it is, I mean, at least for some of them, I think is genuine, like deeply seated racism as well.
Really?
Against specifically Arabs.
I'm telling you.
And Muslims.
I'm telling you. It's the school ground bullies, I'm telling you, in Brooklyn. They're getting revenge. Is there something that interferes with your happiness? Something that's stopping you from living the life that you want? There's a new online service that can help. BetterHelp Online Counseling can connect you with a professional counselor in a safe and private online environment. It's convenient, affordable, and effective. You can get help on your own time and at your own pace. You can schedule secure video or phone sessions, plus chat and text with your therapist. BetterHelp's licensed professional counselors specialize in treating depression, stress, anxiety, relationship problems, sleep issues, trauma, anger, family conflicts, LGBT matters, grief, and self-esteem issues. Anything you share is confidential. BetterHelp has 3,000 licensed therapists across all 50 states with 4 communication modes available: text, chat, phone, and video. You can start communicating in under 24 hours. Financial aid is available for those who qualify. BetterHelp is secure, convenient, and professional. It is not a crisis line. Best of all, it's a truly affordable option. Unregistered listeners get 10% off your first month with discount code RENEGADE. So why not get started today? Go to betterhelp.com/renegade. Simply fill out a questionnaire to help them assess your needs and get matched with a counselor you'll love. That's betterhelp.com/renegade.
Yeah, I mean, I really do think that feeds into it. And you could hear in some of the earlier iterations or like writings of neocons, especially from before 9/11, they were openly bigoted against Arabs. And this is something else I can understand why people think these people are actually just secret Israeli operatives or, dual loyalties people or whatever, is because people like Don Kagan and other neocons have actually sort of used that Likudnik belief about Arabs and Muslims that they only respect us when we're like really forceful. Like, there's actually a quote I have in the film where Don Kagan says on 9/12, the Arabs respect us the most when we are strong. It's just an interesting prism to see the world through.
Right.
And there is an element of dehumanization and sort of like this, that aspect of the world is barbaric and we're the civilized world that needs to essentially erase it.
So how successful have the neocons been? Let's tick it off. So got their war in Afghanistan. They got the full invasion of Iraq. They got the death of Saddam Hussein. They got the bombing of Libya, the death of Gaddafi.
Yeah.
What else have they gotten? How well have they done?
Yeah, I mean, the stuff with Russia is really interesting because it appears that they almost sort of pushed the United States into a hot war scenario on multiple fronts with Russia. In Ukraine and in Syria.
There's a great moment. Another thing I learned from your film, Kagan and Crystal, they first worked together. Do you remember this? Do you know this? It's in your film. The very first thing they worked together on was in supporting Bill Clinton in bombing Kosovo in 1995.
Yes.
This is very important, right? Because again, it's bipartisan, and they're very interested in humanitarian intervention, which that's how Kosovo was framed. But I thought that was really important. And Clinton was carrying forward, I think, a couple hundred years of American foreign policy tradition there, in going into Kosovo and basically doing regime change and nation building. That's what that was.
Yeah.
And I didn't even know this. This is where the neocons first worked together. This is their first sort of political, the new neocons, this new generation. The first time they worked together was on Bill Clinton's Kosovo campaign. I love that, right? So they got that too. They got that bombing. They were successful there. And that's still considered to be a great humanitarian intervention, what the U.S. did in the Balkans. Mm-hmm. And then with Russia, this is why I brought up Kosovo, they've been eager to continue the Cold War since the Cold War ended.
Yeah. And they also take credit for ending the Cold War, which is kind of amusing.
Oh, yeah. Let's do this. So I have one possible beef with you, which is that you tend to describe them, or sometimes describe them, as neo-Reaganites.
Oh, some of the people from, yes.
Okay.
I have described some of them that way before, yeah.
It's a beef. It's not an angry beef. This is more a theoretical thing, but I think it's important. I don't think they're Reaganites. The Reagan is sort of misunderstood. Reagan had 2 phases of his foreign policy in his 8 years in office. There was one phase in which Caspar Weinberger was dominant and introduced what's called the Weinberger Doctrine, which became the Colin Powell Doctrine, which is about the use of overwhelming force. And you use overwhelming force when there's an adversary messing with you, but you don't stay there. You don't occupy a country for extended periods. You just get the job done and then you leave.
Okay.
That's the Weinberger Doctrine, the Caspar Wein, which was that was pretty much Reagan's doctrine. If you notice, Reagan went into a lot of countries and killed quite a few people, but he didn't stay there. He didn't leave troops anywhere, and he wasn't involved in regime change or nation building per se. So I'd be hesitant to call them Reaganites. In fact, I think the Reaganites, they're neo-realists, right, who have always been antagonistic to the idealists, who tend to be more about progressive imperialism and making a Pax Americana and making the United States into the model for the world, or the cops for the world. Reaganites, I think, are more like John McCain. They're sort of nationalistic and very invested in the military and in American military pride. And whenever there's someone who challenges us, and especially kills some of our boys, then we won't stop until they're dead. That's McCain and Reagan to me.
Yeah.
Get rid of the bad guys, but they weren't terribly interested. They didn't have sort of a developed ideology of imperialism, frankly, right? They just didn't have that to the extent that the neocons did, and that Woodrow Wilson did, and that Franklin Roosevelt did, and that John F. Kennedy did, and that Lyndon Johnson did, and Harry Truman, all those people did. So and you and I have actually argued a bit online about this. Like, John Bolton to me is kind of typical of that Reagan neo-realist line. He's a murderer for sure. He wants to kill all the bad guys right now and maybe even nuke them. He has said this, right? But I've not heard him talk about I've not heard him talk in sort of evangelical terms, the way that a lot of American imperialists have. Like, it's America's destiny to uplift the benighted races of the world, to uplift the poor of the world, to go wherever there are sad people and make them happy, which is basically what John F. Kennedy's promise was, right, in his inaugural address, which everyone cheers on. Kennedy was a neocon in that way. Absolutely. He was, and they love him, by the way. They ask a neocon who their favorite presidents were. They will say, every one of them, it was Kennedy, Truman, and Woodrow Wilson.
Well, there's one interesting thing about Kennedy. Are you familiar with Philip Zelikow?
No.
He's kind of one of these guys where, is he a neocon, or what is he kind of guy? He was on the 9/11 Commission, and he wrote one of these really influential books about John F. Kennedy based on the tapes during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And other historians have combed over his book and actually said that he transcribed the tapes deliberately wrong to make John F. Kennedy appear more aggressive during that. So I agree with you. I mean, I definitely think John F. Kennedy did some very neocon things, but there does seem to be historians sort of grappling over, was he trying to be more dovish, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, or more hawkish? And that's still sort of a debate that's happening. But I think my only counter argument to that is that the Reagan administration is where a lot of these people sort of cut their teeth and became influential figures in the first place. So that's where Michael Ledeen, Richard Pearl, Wolfowitz,
right,
Elliot Abrams. There's a lot of these, people who are now very much considered neocons who wielded what appeared to be a pretty big influence over, I don't know if Reagan himself, but definitely people under him. And there is an interesting incident, and you're probably already aware of this, of when, I think it was actually in the Ford administration, when, Paul Wolfowitz and some other people wanted to actually analyze the sort of Soviet threat. They founded some team that's known today now as Team B, where they were actually ascribing every terrorist attack in the world to the Soviet Union, that it was all secretly being funded or, somehow spurred on by the Soviet Union. And that was their argument. But their argument was also that, they kind of started to spin that rhetorical device that Rumsfeld, famously used during the Bush administration about, like, there are known knowns and known unknowns, and I can't even repeat what he said, but that was sort of the approach they were taking with the Soviet Union. So there was definitely, from what I understand, there was definitely like dueling narratives in the Reagan administration about what to do with the Soviet Union. And at various times, sort of that more neoconservative faction won out in regards to, how aggressive to be with the Soviet Union. And I think that sort of the non-neocon consensus almost seemed to have overpowered them at a certain point. But, there was definitely some, just in regards to the Soviet Union, that's most of my understanding about like where the neocon influence came from during the Reagan administration.
Yeah, I'm not saying that they are hostile to the Reaganites at all, but I'm just saying they're different. So, Reagan represented in many ways, and people have written about this, the sort of white working class in a way, leaving the Democratic Party, realizing that liberalism was bankrupt, realizing that we needed a strong national defense, realizing that we needed to take on the Soviets aggressively, realizing, that we needed a large military and to be the dominant power in the world, all that, right? So that's why a lot of sort of working class Democrats went with Reagan, and that's why sort of American nationalism really cohered around Reagan, and he really rode American nationalism to fame and power. But so that's why the neocons overlapped considerably with Reagan and his agenda, right? I'm just saying that Reagan and the Reaganites didn't go as far as the neocons wanted them to go, and they didn't go as far as previous foreign policymakers went. In terms of the vision, the big vision, and thinking of the destiny of the United States, it's really biblical, and the way that foreign policymakers used to think about, and still do think about the United States, and it's not just its right to intervene, but that it has a responsibility to intervene.
Exactly, yeah.
Ever since George Washington, American policy leaders have been saying this about what the United States should do. It's not just that they can invade the Philippines in 1898, but that they should, because there are poor people who are oppressed there, and we must help them. Just like what Samantha Power said about Libya and Syria. So that's all. It's like, it's just sort of I think it's important. It's an important distinction, but maybe at the end of the day, in terms of politics, it's not. They line up, all those people, the Reaganites and the neocons line up on one side of the Iraq war question, and you and I line up on the other side. But the reasons are a little bit different. That's all. Yeah.
Yeah, I think part of what's interesting for me is that the Bush administration has largely defined what neoconservative means to most regular Americans. And that administration seemed very lockstep. It seemed like they really had a very cohesive lockstep agenda, and they really were able to sort of push it through. You look at almost any other presidency aside from that, and sort of the neocon influence in it, and it sort of ebbs and flows, depending on what year. Like, for example, Obama's second term, like we were just talking about before we started recording, is the Ben Rhodes factor in that is interesting.
He was the main foreign policy advisor to Obama, Ben Rhodes.
Yeah.
Yep.
And it appears that they definitely were trying to deliberately buck the foreign policy consensus in various ways in the second term, even going as far as they coined the term, and I don't know if it existed before then, but they believed that they were trying to basically push back what they called the blob in D.C. And of course, Obama did so many terrible things that could be described as neocon, Libya being one of the main ones. But it is interesting that it does seem like there is almost, and this is something I don't think most people understand, that there is also a line between Obama and Trump in terms of them drawing back from these obligations that you're talking about, these quote unquote responsibilities that we have. Right. And I believe that, as much as Trump acts like he hates Obama and then was the worst president ever, I believe Trump kind of picked up on some of that. And there is some continuity in that regard. And if you actually go back to the last 2 years of the Obama administration, that's when the media started to sort of turn on him as well, especially on Syria. And even some people in his own cabinet now will go out and essentially blame Obama for like a genocide in Syria. I think Samantha Powers has kind of blamed Obama for letting so many people die in Syria.
Has she?
Yeah.
Wow.
Newland blamed Obama for letting people die in Ukraine since she's left. So there was definitely something that changed and shifted away from, pushing the neoconservative agenda. I don't know about Clinton, but, you can almost make the argument that Bush, there was some aspects of the Bush administration that started to pull back a little bit on neoconservative agenda as well. Like Iran, I think, is a good example.
His second term was much less belligerent.
Yes.
Yeah, he definitely pulled back.
And there did seem to be a ramping up of propaganda against Iran at the end of the Bush administration that never really amounted to anything super significant.
Right.
And that's actually when I would describe the first major neocon split happened was towards the end of the Bush administration when a certain group of the more intellectual, more educated writer neocons, Kristol and Kagan, they decided to stop talking about regime change in Iran. And several other neocons continued on talking about it. Specifically, a neocon think tank called the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which is kind of focused entirely on regime change in Iran.
Really?
Yeah. Huh. That's where Michael Ledeen, James Woolsey, so I want to say Richard Pearl, but I'm not sure.
Okay.
So it seemed like a split started to occur then, where it wasn't a split in what they believed, it was a split in how they behaved in public. Because I think certain smarter ones knew that the public had already become aware of how blatantly evil they were, and they wanted to sort of, rebrand a little bit. Rebrand for the Obama era, essentially.
Yeah. So they're still alive and well, you think?
Yeah, I mean...
And still influential.
Yes, but it's much harder to determine where their influence is now because there's not as much of a lockstep consensus and an overwhelming force that's visible.
They hate Trump.
Yes.
They're leaders of the anti or never Trump movement. Kristol and Kagan and company hate Trump and always have.
Yeah.
So, we don't have any card-carrying neocons in the Trump administration since John Bolton isn't really... he was a signer to PNAC.
He was a founding director, yeah.
He was a founding director of PNAC, but as I've said, that doesn't necessarily mean he shares the whole ideology of neoconservatism, which is really, as I said before, a traditional American foreign policy ideology.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Like American imperialist ideology.
Yeah.
I don't see that in Bolton. I see in him a great desire to bomb the shit out of America's enemies.
Yeah.
But I don't see him talking about leaving constabulary forces permanently or having bases around the world forever or directing countries to introduce democracy or to giving rights to gays and women, et cetera, around the world. Those are all neocon, traditional, progressive, imperialist talking points.
That's true, yeah.
And I don't see that in the Trump administration at all.
Well, the only thing I'll say about that is that there is something interesting about Bolton where I believe he has taken some of sort of Trump personality and Trump's foreign policy rhetoric and merged it with, to some degree, with almost like a classic imperialism doesn't really resemble the sort of humanitarian guise of neoconservatism, where John Bolton has actually openly suggested that the attempts to do regime change in Venezuela and in Iran would be particularly good for us because of the oil. So he has sort of adopted that. It's almost like no leader.
Okay.
Even, I don't know if previous to Trump you can make the argument, but it doesn't seem like leaders normally talk that way, or foreign policy people.
True.
Are not normally nakedly, openly talking about just, stealing another country's resources for our own gain. So that's an interesting new thing to how John Bolton is talking about foreign policy.
This is, I think you and I argued on Twitter about this a few years ago. I think this is it. This is, to me, why Bolton is not a neocon. The neocons would be happy to leave the oil in the ground if Israel is strong and America is hegemonic. Don't you agree? That's what they want. They want America and Israel to be hegemonic. How they get... Now, the thing is, you need oil in order to be hegemonic. Mm-hmm. So that's why they want the oil. But now that the United States is no longer dependent on Middle Eastern oil, it seems to me as a neocon, as a true believer, as an American imperialist, that's secondary. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting take. I think, there's so many other aspects to being hegemonic, though, besides just foreign oil. So I do think there is a lot of that's wrapped up in just traditional imperialism and pillaging resources. But that's again where I get sort of tripped up is the sincerity of how much they actually believe in this spreading democracy angle.
Right.
I think it mostly is what you said earlier, which is just maintaining American and Israeli hegemony. Mm-hmm. I think that primarily that's it, and they use humanitarianism as as a fake cover, sort of, to basically achieve that goal.
It's a good question. We should know the answer to this, but they must have had extensive discussions about democracy. Kristol and Kagan and company, they must have talked about this. Do they think, because this is a theory that's common among democratic theorists, do they think that democracies are inherently more stable and more sympathetic to the United States and more willing to work with the United States? That would mean to me that they would be pro-democratic. Are they just pro-democratic because they're pro-democratic? Do they just love democracy and believe it's the best system of governance? tend to think so. Or is it just a means to an end? Is it a means to a more stable, pro-American, more neocon world? I don't know. Have they ever talked about it?
I don't know if they've talked about it in that, that's a really good question.
Are they actually pro-democracy? I don't know.
I would lean towards the last thing you said.
Yeah.
That it's the ends justifies the means.
Yeah.
Because I do think Machiavelli does have a pretty profound impact on the way that they think.
They do talk about him a lot.
Yeah, especially Ledeen. I mean, he wrote a whole book on him. And, a lot of people take this all back to Leo Strauss, who is sort of an interesting figure in the sense that he definitely was like not pro-democracy in a lot of ways. So
Leo Strauss was a philosophy professor at the University of Chicago who was the professor and mentor of many of the neocons, especially Paul Wolfowitz. Right?
Yes.
Yeah, right.
That's like the most famous name. I think there were some other people that made it in the Reagan administration, but yeah, for the most part, he's considered like the brainchild of it, even though his own children now say that he's actually would have been opposed to it.
So tell us about Leo Strauss.
There's a reason. I mean, I didn't include him in the film, so I sort of started it at the starting point of Irving Kristol. But yeah, Leo Strauss, he was a philosophy professor. He was also a strong proponent of Zionism, and he believed that liberalism fundamentally led to nihilism and basically just a complete implosion of society. And so he was, I don't know, because the term neoconservative is sort of defined by this person who used to be liberal, who went to conservative. So I don't think there's anything involving him having like a previously, left or liberal mindset like some of these other people. He was just highly influential. And a lot of people back then sort of saw him as almost like a contrarian against, how academia has always been dominated by, left-leaning people. Mm-hmm. And some people would argue, well, if he was alive, if the right had dominated academia, he would have been coming as contrarian from the left. I don't know if I buy that. I mean, and I just find it interesting that he, in a lot of ways, he's actually like less hawkish and not as nakedly shitty as some of these other neoconservatives are. He even actually rejected Zionism, like sort of towards the end of his life. He seems a little bit more actually intellectual than some of these other people.
So what brought you to this project? Why did you do this? You've been working on it for several years now. You're not even finished with it.
No.
And this has taken obsessive attention to detail, obsessive research. You've done a ton of work. Why? Why this?
Well, I mean, completely honest, it started as a very, very personal project of mine that was a direct result of witnessing my sister getting into sort of the line of fire from neocons.
Okay.
And I was still pretty politically active at the time that this happened, but I didn't understand or realize that they were still all around and still writing so prolifically and had an influence over the Obama administration. So, and just a little bit of backstory with that. My sister basically, when Russia went into Crimea and essentially annexed it, my sister went out on her Russia Today show and said that she thought what Russia did was dumb and what the U.S. was trying to do by meddling.
I think she said it was wrong, actually.
Yeah, she was wrong.
On RT.
Yeah, on RT.
As an RT anchor.
Yeah. And so
Russia Today, this is a state-sponsored network.
Yes.
And she said that what Russia did in Crimea was, quote, wrong.
Yes.
Yeah.
And she was also trying to sort of make the argument that the whole thing was completely ridiculous, that the United States role was wrong as well. Mm-hmm. But what happened was, and it was kind of a similar experience to the beheading video that I made, where all of a sudden the media latched onto this soundbite of hers and lifted her up as like this anti-Russian hero for like a whole day. And then all of a sudden, several neocons, names I didn't recognize at the time, but I sort of realized that they were neocons later on, dug up all the stuff about Abby from her past, the truther stuff, the 9/11 stuff. And they were like, she's actually a plant to make Russia look like they allow
dissent. Right.
And actually, the funniest one was that Jamie Kirchick, I don't know if you're familiar with who he is, he called what Abby did a false flag.
Yes.
And I found that rather amusing.
Oh, you did another really good thing your film does is it shows, because Jamie Kirchick reminds me of this, how I remembered from watching your film, this thing I'd forgotten about. For a couple of years there, everybody was talking about Russia's anti-gay, homophobia, the persecution of gays in Russia around the Sochi Olympics and all that stuff. Remember, everybody was talking about Putin as this homophobe.
Yeah.
Before they were worried about him expanding into Ukraine or whatever. But you show that Jamie Kirchick was the main sort of talking head pushing this.
And Dan Savage.
And Dan Savage is right, yeah.
Who, I cannot prove this with certainty, but I believe that he was actually like working with the Obama White House. Dan Savage was. Well, we know later on that he was actually literally working with the Obama administration on the It Gets Better video series.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't think it's that much of a stretch to suggest that the Stolichnaya vodka boycott was partially orchestrated by the Obama administration.
But that's what got Americans hating Putin.
Exactly.
Americans didn't know who Putin was.
Well, and not just Americans, but liberal Americans. I think that's the most important part of it, because if you go back even to the Irving Kristol and Counter Magazine thing, that magazine wasn't being distributed to conservatives. It was being distributed to people that could be described as Cold War neutral liberals who didn't give a shit. And it was trying to indoctrinate them with why we need to be on, take the side of the U.S. in the Cold War. And I think that that's one of the most important things that the neocons have been able to achieve, is moving the needle and actually getting people from the other side of the political aisle to adopt whatever agenda they have at the time.
Yeah.
So, for example, Kosovo, like you brought up earlier. Bill Kristol's proud of the fact that he says he lost half of all the Weekly Standard subscribers when they wrote that. Because then his subscribers were thinking, why are you pro-Clinton now?
Right.
They're just pro-foreign policy imperialism.
Right.
So...
Yeah, well, look what they did. They used identity politics of all things, right? And the neoconservatives used this, ostensibly pro-gay agenda, right? To essentially continue the Cold War.
Exactly.
And I did not make that connection until I saw your film. But it's exactly what it was. No one cared. Liberals didn't care about Putin. In fact, if anything, they were a little bit soft on Putin and thought that the Republicans were going too hard on him, right? Until this happens, and then all of a sudden Putin's this evil guy that we have to do away with. This is about, 5-6 years ago, right? When the sort of Putin as the homophobe was the big trope.
Absolutely.
And I forgot, and then that came right in, and right after that is the election of 2016, when Putin then becomes, the person we must remove from the world to make it safe for democracy and the United States.
And this is sort of what you're describing now is just something that I had a gut reaction to. Like, I was like, this seems to be happening, but I don't know how it's happening. And it wasn't until I made my film that I sort of discovered who Jamie Kirchick was, discovered, sort of the intricacies of how it's happening. And there were actual think tank talks and think tank papers being written about using identity politics, specifically the Russian anti-gay law, as a foreign policy tool.
Yep.
I mean, it's out there in the open.
Yep. And Pussy Riot's part of this also, right?
Absolutely.
They were.
I mean, Vice. I mean, there are so many bizarre facets to it. Even Google was on this years before Putin was even like a household topic. Yeah. I mean, like they were hosting some of these think tank talks, having to do with Russia's gay law in like 2013.
He was homophobic, and then Pussy Riot proved that he was a misogynist and that Russia was a misogynist country, right?
That they ran gulags and everyone in Russia goes to gets thrown in a
And this is all before
dungeon.
The 2016 election. They're planting the seeds. And it occurs to me, and I never thought about this, but of course Pussy Riot was very much a part of this.
And you can sort of trace the steps. I mean, first it was the Litvinenko murder, which,
the journalist.
Yeah, which was all, polonium. Everyone has come to the consensus now that Putin directly assassinated him and wanted the world to know that he gave him, because he gave him polonium. And then the Magnitsky Act, which was another sort of seed that was planted. And then the Sochi Olympics, I think, was really when it sort of all exploded. And even before the gay law, it was just like, this Olympics is completely corrupt. You've siphoned all this money from the Russian people. The conditions of the Olympics were in squalor. Every Western journalist was mocking it. A complete difference from the way that, even when the Olympics happened, I think in Beijing, like a couple years before, the American media was like way more generally respectful.
Yeah.
Of the Olympic Games.
So Jamie Kirchick is on cable news almost every night. He's writing op-eds for the Daily Beast during this period constantly about the homophobia in Russia and what a problem Putin is and how he must be removed. And at that time, Jamie Kirchick is also where? Which think tank?
The Foreign Policy Initiative.
Which was
Bill Kristol's new rebranded version of Project for the New American Century.
Yeah. The reason that we even knew about homophobia in Russia was because of the neocons.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I think that's your film shows that.
Pretty much. I
never thought of it. That never occurred to me.
And it's so strange and surreal too, because Vice and these other sort of millennial, call them hipster outlets, whatever you want to call them, were also very instrumental in this. I mean, the Daily Beast was probably one of the more mainstream outlets that was really pushing it. But it was in Out Magazine. Jamie Kirchick was writing articles for Out Magazine, the most popular gay print publication. Yeah. BuzzFeed was really into this as well, which is interesting. Especially because they were the ones who later released the dossier.
Right.
So there's some interesting things you can sort of look back on and be like, wow, the BuzzFeed and the Daily Beast and Vice were like really on this, from the very beginning. How is that possible?
All in the service of expanding NATO.
Exactly.
As far as we can, and removing Putin and any rival on the Eurasian landmass.
Yeah.
We can't have any rival there, and Putin's at least a potential rival to American hegemony.
Yep.
We've got to remove him. That's according to the neocons, and that's according to every, again, imperialist foreign policy maker in this country's history, I would say. It's so amazing to see that, though, in your film, like how all these different things, it seems so unrelated to foreign policy, get used in the service of very particular foreign policies and momentous foreign policy decisions, extending the Cold War past the Cold War and the beginning and the what's been going on now with Russiagate in the last couple of years and the insanity there. And so Abby Martin gets on camera when she's an RT anchor and says what Russia did in Crimea is wrong, and then what happened to her. She gets lambasted by the neocons who say she's a truther and
got lifted up as a hero.
Right.
And then that's when the neocons came in and tried to tear her down.
Right, but she's no longer at RT, so what happened?
Well, she was. It was weird. They let her stay on, but they kind of saddled her there. And she wanted to be a team player, and she was stuck in a really difficult position because they didn't fire her, but they essentially took away all her team. So towards in the last year and a half, or maybe year that she was there, she was working as her main producer was an intern. Like she didn't even have any other team. So they were punishing her basically behind the scenes. But she was, still very adamant that she believed the U.S., was primarily the one doing the worst stuff. And it was basically that incident. I mean, it was such a personal thing for me to watch people who I knew were directly related to these, Bill Kristol group of neocons going after my sister, that it just so deeply personally affected me that's sort of what sparked my obsession initially with, because it was something I'd always been interested in, I'd been interested in 9/11 Truth. I've been interested in the neocons as far back as, Fahrenheit 9/11, Power of Nightmares by Adam Curtis, but it wasn't something I was deeply knowledgeable about. So I was like, now I'm going to find out every fucking thing I can about these people now.
And you certainly did. You certainly did. You got to watch this film if you think you know everything about the neocons. I thought I knew everything about the neocons until I saw this film, and I've learned a lot from it. So let's talk about your background politically. You said before we turned on the mics that you and Abby weren't really political. You don't come from a political family. Even you're from the East Bay here in San Francisco Bay Area, but that you were from sort of a regular suburban middle-class family that was apolitical.
Yeah.
And how did you become political? And you became so political, both of you.
Yeah, I mean, my political awakening was I met a Japanese girl who was going to UC Santa Cruz while I was going to audio engineering school, and she was not really political herself, but I was with her on the morning of 9/11, and I remember being really taken by her reaction to it. Like, I remember she was sobbing on the day of 9/11, and I remember trying to just sort of console her and talk to her. And it was really fascinating to me that she wasn't upset or sobbing because of watching all these people die on television. She was sobbing because she knew that America was about to turn it up to 11 and attack another country. And I just couldn't understand where she was coming from. I was like, do you really think that's going to happen? Like, it just,
She was coming from Japan.
Yeah.
A place that knows something about that.
And she was just like, we're going to attack somebody. Like tomorrow, like I guarantee you we're going to attack somebody. And she was absolutely right. I mean, it was like within maybe 24 hours that it was like, we're going to go into Afghanistan. You know, they have bin Laden. And I remember just from that moment forward, it was sort of me almost becoming untethered from that media cycle after 9/11, where I was already very quickly like almost seeing it from the outside. Like, how are they able to? I was just honestly confused how they were making this case to the American public, even on Afghanistan. I was like, but why are we attacking? Like, if we're just getting bin Laden, like, why don't we just get him? Like, why don't I just had a very hard time wrapping my head around it. And then when Iraq came around, I was just like, this is absolute bullshit. They've completely pivoted to Iraq. This makes no sense. So I was already like pretty unplugged then. And I don't remember if it was before the Iraq war, but sometime in between the Afghanistan war and the Iraq war, she took me back to Japan. I stayed with her family. We went to the Hiroshima Museum. And that just came to me as a total shock. Like, I had it wasn't that I believed that it was right that America dropped 2 nuclear weapons. It was just that I just never thought about it. And that was that really shifted my perspective on a lot of things. You know, I'm just like, wow, we've done this horrible, horrible thing to another country, but yet we don't atone for it in any way here. We're not told that it was something we have to atone for. Like, you know, for example, like interning the Japanese, we act like we need to atone for that as a society. You know, we've already paid some kind of reparations.
That's right.
Nothing with Hiroshima. I mean, like, and it's still honestly fascinating to me that 2019, it's still kind of controversial to suggest that as some kind of war crime or horrific, act that the United States has done.
You know what's the most amazing thing about Hiroshima and Nagasaki to me? That they were relatively minor bombing attacks on Japan during that time.
Compared to the fire bombings.
The bombings that preceded them, which lasted for a solid year of daily, basically round-the-clock fire bombings of every single 67 cities in Japan were firebombed. 50 to 90% of the population in those cities were killed, and those cities were leveled.
Yeah.
Leveled. Tokyo was absolutely leveled. There was nothing but ash and cinder and rubble in Tokyo.
It's wild.
And Kobe and Yokohama and Osaka and all of them. Every single city except Kyoto was bombed to the ground.
Was that actually? I was just wondering that the other day. Did they deliberately not firebomb Kyoto because they respected the history?
Yes, because of the emperor. Yes, because they were making a promise. That they would allow the emperor to stay on, which they did.
Because if you go to Japan now, it's actually one of the only cities, besides out in the countryside, where there are many old wooden structures. Yeah, still standing.
The United States flattened that country, flattened it, and killed just incredible numbers of civilians and children. And I mean, it's just unbelievable amount of just murder.
Yeah.
And destruction. And so, your girlfriend at the time, she knew something about that. I think, that it's not surprising that someone from Japan would be very nervous when the United States is gets angry at another country.
You just brought something else to my memory that I completely forgot until now, that I remember when I visited her grandma at this coastal town. I don't know how to pronounce the name. It's Amore, I think. It's on the coast. I think it's in the south of Japan. And she was like, oh yeah, there was like a plaque somewhere, like all in Japanese. And she's like, oh yeah, this says that this is the river where people jumped in to like escape the firebombing. And when they jumped out of the river, they were still on fire. Mm-hmm. And I was just like, what? Like, we used napalm back then? That also just broke my brain, because I was like, I thought napalm was like invented during Vietnam. All these things were just so shocking to me.
Napalm was first used in those firebombing attacks.
Horrifying.
That's right.
No, it's crazy. I mean, I guess compared to the firebombings, the nukes were, a sliver of the amount of deaths. But I think I first learned about that actually on the Errol Morris.
They killed 100,000 people in one night.
Holy shit.
During one of them. Oh, wow. Yeah. Yeah, in Tokyo. Yeah. 100,000 people in a single night.
Yeah, I think I first learned about that in the Robert McNamara.
That's right. McNamara talks about it in detail in Fog of War. He gives the numbers, in fact. And he says a great thing in that film. He says, you know what? We all knew that if we had lost the war, we would have been tried and convicted and executed as war criminals. We knew that. We knew that we had to win the war. Otherwise, we would have been hanged to death as war criminals.
Wow.
And he says we were war criminals for what we did to the Japanese people. And I don't see how you could argue otherwise.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about, we don't know exactly how many, but probably tens of thousands just of children.
Oh, yeah.
Just children. Probably tens of thousands of children.
Well, if you talk to most Americans about it today who have a little bit of like, American indoctrination, they just have this like sort of whataboutism approach where it's like, well, what about the rape of Nanking and the comfort women? It's like,
sure.
That's not really addressing the point.
We should definitely drop a nuclear bomb.
Yeah, exactly.
On an entirely civilian part of a major city, which is what Nagasaki was. This is another thing about Nagasaki people don't know. The original target was another city. I forget the name of it, but it was a different city, and there was cloud cover that day, so they kept going. The second target was Nagasaki, so they went to Nagasaki. It was covered in clouds too, but the guy was running out of fuel in the airplane, and so he claimed that a hole opened up suddenly in the clouds, and then he dropped the bomb against orders. By the way, he was supposed to not use radar.
New to me, I didn't know this.
And they missed the target entirely and dropped it on an entirely residential civilian part of Nagasaki.
No shit.
Yeah.
Wow.
Totally civilian. And so it was nothing but schools and hospitals and universities and houses and tens of thousands. We don't even know to this day, but tens of thousands.
Wasn't Nagasaki supposed to be the actual, like it was supposed to be the military target, right? Like that was what they say.
There were two
compared to Hiroshima.
There were two Mitsubishi arms factories that they ostensibly were going after them, but like that's how sort of cavalier they were about the whole thing. It's just and how cheap life was then, especially Japanese lives. I mean, just incredibly cheap. They just didn't care. They cared so little about civilian deaths that's how they treated it. This was an atomic bomb, and the guy was like, "Well, I got to get rid of it now, so let's drop it." There's a hole in the clouds. Now we missed the target entirely. We killed wild. Tens of thousands of people. So yeah, there you go. So you became politicized by that. That's a good way to start. I like anybody political who starts off anti-war in their politics, I always get along with. It's just a thing. It's like a litmus test almost for me, right? I mean, I don't know if you find the same thing, but like,
I think so. Yeah.
If your politics are good on war and foreign policy, like I can hang out with you, even if we disagree on everything else. Like that is just so important. It's the most important thing to me, and I just find that often the rest of people's politics tends to be simpatico with mine if they're good according to me on foreign policy. I don't know if you find that too, but
I do, yeah. And I think I'm a lot of people have accused me recently of being a purist, like on foreign policy, because there's sort of become almost kind of like a trendy version of what being anti-war is now. That's become a little more broad, and in some cases maybe even a little too right wing for my.
Is it trendy?
taste.
I wish it were trendy. God, no one cares about foreign policy, right?
I mean, there is a weird. Yeah, I mean, I guess overall, I'm narrowly focusing on the Twitter sphere, or like a small sector of like social media. But yeah, it's weird. I mean, I don't know. Like, I definitely don't get along with people who dehumanize Muslims or Arabs, and I even notice there is still like a strain of that sort of entered the anti-war movement, which is odd and kind of new for me.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about something we'll fight about?
Sure.
Maybe. I don't know.
You might have an idea. I don't even know what we'd fight about.
We'll see.
We've already gotten over the Bolton.
So
in a neocon.
yeah, that's a technical thing.
I think we probably disagree on some aspects of Trump, but I don't know if
I don't care. So Venezuela.
Okay.
That's where I know Abby has been very active around this. She's been to Venezuela many times. She's reported from Venezuela. She's been, is this fair to say, sympathetic to the regime there, the Maduro regime and the Chavez regime.
The Chavistas, yeah.
The Chavistas, generally speaking, yes. And I take it you are too?
I mean, I am very strongly against U.S. efforts to do regime change there. Mm-hmm. I have less of a standing on the actual government there. Okay. So I don't know if I kind of just don't have a huge opinion about it. Okay. But I definitely admired, if we're just isolating it to the way that Chavez stood up to the Bush administration and some of his rhetoric, I admired that strongly in a similar way that I actually admired Ahmadinejad's rhetoric. I mean, so I have sort of an affinity for that in that sense.
There's an anti-imperialism.
For sure.
In their rhetoric, right? Yeah. That you like. Okay. I mean, I suppose. Sure. Okay, so you're not really a partisan.
I guess not. Yeah.
Okay. But Abby seems like she is.
Well, she definitely has much more of a stake in that, yeah.
Okay.
She's much more socialist.
I was going to say,
I
so
am.
she's very clearly a socialist.
Yeah.
And are you?
I don't think I would describe myself that way.
Oh, really? Okay.
But I'm, like I'm very much for example, like universal health care.
Mm-hmm.
But I also sort of wince at the idea of giving the federal government in its current state that kind of level of authority.
Oh, really?
But I still really want it.
Huh. Uh-huh.
So I guess I have some contradictory beliefs.
I like it. I like it a lot, actually. That's much better than most people who are not contradictory. They should be more contradictory in their beliefs.
But I think going back to what you said, I think
Yeah.
that's my primary thing is anti-war.
Yeah.
And not pacifism, but like I am very, very against dehumanizing people in other countries. Or even, making a big deal about the way another country behaves in any way. Like it's something that I'm just kind of ideologically opposed to. I feel like we need to focus inward at the things we do to other countries more than we need to actually focus on another country that they're doing bad things. So
yeah, okay, I like it. So I just had this fantasy suddenly of we're sitting in your studio in your house in the Oakland Hills. I had this fantasy of like Bill Kristol and Bob Kagan walking in the door right now and sitting on the couch next to us, right? Because I feel like they should be here.
yeah.
Because we know so much about them and they don't even know that we're talking about them. I just think that's wrong. It's impolite.
I agree.
And I'm just wondering what we would say to them if both those guys walked in and sat down. I feel like I do know them. It would be very almost chummy. Because I said I have a crush on Kagan, and I sort of do. What would you ask them if you could ask them anything?
Well, that's an interesting question because I had the opportunity. Do you already know about this? I talked to Kagan.
No.
So I had the opportunity to speak to Bob Kagan, and I feel like I kind of flubbed it. But I did get one thing out of him that was pretty fascinating. So right before the election, Hillary Clinton's campaign officially announced a fundraiser from foreign policy professionals. Yeah, I think the group was Young Foreign Policy Professionals for America. And what it really was just a NATO like internship program for people trying to graduate into the foreign policy wonk circuit. So when I went there, and it was Hillary Clinton, official sponsored campaign event, speaker Robert Kagan.
Yeah.
So I was like, that's enough information where I need to go to this event because this is like the coming out party. That's how I kind of saw it. Yeah. This is coming out party where the neocons are explicitly endorsing the Democrats as opposed to Donald Trump. So I bought a VIP pass, and with the VIP pass, you're allowed to mingle, with the speakers. So I get up in this hotel balcony, and I see Robert Kagan, and I'm sitting there like I feel like I'm nerding out on all these obscure think tankers from my movie. Like I see the head of the Atlantic Council sitting in some like really $1,000 tailored suit. I see all these people. I see Robert Kagan's daughter, and I'm like, oh my god, that's his daughter. I was expecting Victoria Nuland to come in. So I was there, and I was pretty, let's just say I was pretty anxious about the whole thing. Like it was pretty intense for me. Mm-hmm. So I just walked up to Robert Kagan and I said, hi, nice to meet you. And he put out his hand and said, hi, nice to meet you. He saw my VIP pass. And the only question I really got out to him that he gave a full answer to was, do you think Hillary Clinton will end up sending offensive weapons to Ukraine? And why do you think Obama seems to be dragging his feet in doing this? And he went on for about a minute, basically mocking Obama and laughing about how Obama, in a private White House conversation he had with him, told him that he didn't want to have a nuclear war with Russia over Ukraine. And he was essentially making fun of him to me, who, obsessively was a Democratic donor.
Yeah.
So it was just a very strange interchange.
He was mocking Obama for being soft.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then he kind of turned around to the crowd around him like he was at, holding court at a party. And he was like, well, what does he want to have a nuclear war over? Germany? Estonia?
Pussy.
Yeah.
That's right.
So I recorded that and I kind of like released it as we put it on one of our podcasts. And The Intercept ended up writing about it and just sort of like quoted my discussion in it. But like, I didn't really, that was all that came of it.
Let's try this. I will pretend to be Bob Kagan and you talk to me. What do you want to ask me? What would you really want to know though? Like let's say he was staying with you, spending the night here. So you had a lot of time with him.
Yeah.
What would you, right? You've been obsessively studying this guy for years now. If you got the chance to really sit down with him, not on some hotel balcony with a VIP pass, but like really talk to the guy, what would you want to know?
I guess the first thing I want to talk to him about is about Anthrax.
Well, speaking as Robert Kagan, I
Yeah.
can tell you, Mr. Martin, that I had nothing to do with that. Okay, but the people, we know that there are people in the world, not professors of history, okay? There are many people in the world who use things like anthrax. They tend to be people like Saddam Hussein. Am I wrong about that?
Yeah, you're wrong about that because the only people who are most of the anthrax manufacturers from the United States
Oh, okay.
at the time. And that's where it's actually been discovered to have come from,
Okay.
the United States Bioweapons Lab. So,
All right, well, what else do you want to know about me?
did your father really, was he a champion street fighter in Lithuania?
Is that what they say about him? Really? And I'm telling you, it all comes down to street fighting with these guys.
Yeah, right?
I'm telling you, it does. It all comes down to street fighting.
Was your dad's neocon moment, his being mugged by reality moment when the black student activist took over the
At Cornell, right? Was it
Yeah.
Cornell? Yes, it was. My dad was very angry with the black students at Cornell when they locked us in that building and made fun of us and called us names. Next question.
Did you have to masturbate in a coffin during your Skull and Bones initiation pledge?
That is a myth about Skull and Bones, but we do run the world.
Okay. So there was no, you didn't get pissed on or nothing like that?
No,
Okay.
we don't do golden showers. We only look at maps
Okay.
and Skull and Bones. We look at a lot of maps. We don't masturbate onto the maps.
Okay.
We hold that for later,
Okay.
but we do love maps because we like to know what's out there and who's out there, you know. Any other questions for me? Do you want to know why I kill people or why I like to kill people or why?
Well, I mean, have you ever directly killed anyone?
No, not to my knowledge. Indirectly, though,
yeah,
I've killed a whole lot of people, and I'm very happy about that because we live in a much more peaceful world now, don't we? We live in a better world. There is no Soviet Union. There is no more totalitarian dictatorship staring at us. The Nazis dead and gone because of the United States, right, Mr. Martin? Okay. All those evil communists who were they not, you know, in Cambodia and Vietnam, these were not nice people. Stalin was not a nice guy. Okay. They're gone because of us. Dead and gone because of us. So I ask you again, Mr. Martin, why are you watching clips of me on C-SPAN and poring over all of my books? Why are you obsessed with me, sir?
Well, I think at the heart of it, I don't think you're sincere. I think you're a pathological liar.
How dare you? Like I've devoted my life to this. Do you know how many books I've written making this argument that the United States is inherently imperialistic and should continue to be forever?
I do.
You don't think I
own every
believe?
single
Wait,
one.
you really don't think I believe this? I'm just writing these books for the hell of it? What do you think I want?
Oh, I think you believe that the American imperialism should continue on forever.
You think I'm just for the sake of imperialism? I just want imperialism for the sake of it. That's all I want. Well, come on, Robbie. Mr. Martin, do better. Of course I believe in this, man. I think, and I'm speaking as Robert Kagan, I'm sure he would agree with me. I believe the United States of America is the greatest nation ever in history. It's sort of objectively true. We're wealthier, we're better off, we're freer than any other group of people ever in world history. Robbie Martin, am I wrong? I know your sister's a communist, but come on. No, this is what they believe. And therefore, shouldn't we expand the goodness that is America? Shouldn't you want to allow those poor people in the Middle East who shit into holes in the ground to continue to live that way? Who have no vote?
You're doing too good of a job here.
Where women have to wear sacks over their faces? Where gays are thrown off of roofs? Come on, man. We live in the best place on earth in human history. And so the more America there is, the better the world is. This seems like an obvious logic to me. Do I need to spell this out more?
How do you know? I mean, that's with the assumption that everybody wants to adopt American values.
They don't because they're ignorant, because they're illiterate, because they're poor, because they live in third world dictatorships where the dictator doesn't allow them a proper education.
So you think you believe that people were
That was true, by the way. I mean, come on. Do you think they had freedom of speech under Saddam's Iraq? No. Do you think they had freedom of speech in the Soviet Union? No. Do you think they had freedom of speech in Gaddafi's Libya? No. Do you think that you could just go get any old book? You think you could go buy a Noam Chomsky book in Libya or no. Sorry.
Well,
they didn't know any better because they weren't allowed to know any better. So we had to invade. We had to give them books. We had to teach them what is possible in this world. And what is possible in this world is to live like Americans.
Well, inherently, I mean, people don't want to be fucked around with.
Inherently?
Yeah. I mean,
That's innate. People get fucked around with all the time, and they allow it to happen constantly. What are you talking about? You got to have better answers. This is a dress rehearsal for when you finally get him. When you get Kagan in a room.
This is good. No, I need to do. I'm really bad at this, even in general.
Israel,
drama class.
Israel, the only wealthy democratic nation in the entire Middle East. Come on, man. We need to support them. What? Why shouldn't we?
Does Lebanon not have a democracy?
It seems to me just objectively true that we need an American empire and we need to expand it because we live really well. We watch lots of TV here in this country. We are that rich. Do you know how much time Americans spend watching TV? That's a wealthy people. Have you noticed how big Americans are? That's a well-fed people. We're very well fed. We have a ton of leisure time and we're rich. The poorest Americans are wealthier than much of the world's population. Yet you and your communist sister seem to think that this is some evil empire, in fact, and that we shouldn't. We should actually be very shy about who we are. We should be reserved. We shouldn't be trying to extend the beneficence of the United States outward. We should just be keeping it towards. It's selfish, Robbie. You're saying we should be selfish. We should hold on to these things and not give them away to others. Do you know how poor people are in the world compared to us?
Well, we should make America great again.
Yes. So we need to make America great, which is why we need the oil, because we can't be great without oil, or at least some other, maybe nuclear power will work. But once we have the power, then is it not selfish of us to not extend it outward? Dude, think about it.
See what you're doing. This is really good.
All right, let me make it harder for you. Let me make it harder for you. So you said you aren't a socialist, but you do like universal health care, that idea. Your sister's a socialist, though. So are we not obligated? Are not the wealthy obligated to help the poor? You see? See, the neocons, remember that where they started. They started off as lefties. This is the logic of neoconservatism, I submit. It comes from that left-wing Christian evangelical idea that we are obligated to what? Help our brother, to be our brother's keeper. Yes?
Yeah, I mean, I think so, yeah.
Okay. This is why you should no longer be a leftist. This is why you should call Abby right now and tell her to give up on socialism, because eventually you're going to become like the Kagans. If we are morally obligated to help the poor people in East Oakland from our wealthy perch in the hills of Oakland, then why aren't we obligated to help all the poor people outside the national borders of the United States? Answer the question. Seriously, that's what the Kagans would say to you. That's what Irving Kristol and Bill Kristol would say to you. That's what the Podoritzes would say to you. If we're obligated, Mr. Lefty, Mr. Bernie Sanders, universal health care, to help the poor in this country, aren't we obligated to help the poor everywhere? And they're everywhere. They're all over the world. There's poor and oppressed people all over the world who live worse than we do.
Yeah.
With our privileged white selves up here. I'm telling you, it's a left-wing argument that the neocons are making. I think it's not an accident that they started off as Trotskyists.
Yeah.
And Marxists and socialists and social democrats.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And what you've just done is a great example of how, in a way, bulletproof. I mean, they're very, very smart.
Yeah.
So if I was to meet Robert Kagan and try to have like a philosophical argument with him, I would need to really, really practice.
Yeah. This is your opportunity, man. He says this amazing thing. He says it in his book and he said it in speeches ever since. And I think he's completely right and brilliant. I am on the opposite side of him politically, but he says it's all about the Declaration of Independence. And people are like, what? Yeah. And it's in your film.
Yeah.
And people are like, what the hell does that have to do with foreign policy? Mm-hmm. And he's like, hello, it's a universal moral claim. All men are created equal. And if they're not treated equally, that's a problem. And they have the right to rise up and overthrow their oppressors, et cetera, right? So once you establish that as a universal right, it's a universal moral claim. All people have the right to live according to this. Mm-hmm. Well, then we're obligated to make that happen, are we not? The Kagans would say. And I say, yes, the logic makes sense to me. Once you start there, once you start making universal moral claims, the tanks start rolling right behind it.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
But the one area where that that framework of logic wouldn't work for them is with the Palestinians.
Well, here's the thing. So a lot of people, and it's just coincidental that they tend to be dark-skinned, but a lot of people in the world don't agree with us. This is the problem. Okay. Now, that is a combination of ignorance, as I said, lack of education, lack of access to books and reading. They're illiterate, and, some of that's not their fault. It's because of the dictators who oppress them. Every good idea has had its detractor in history. If you think the Palestinians are so much better than we are, okay, and smarter than we are, because we're professors, remember? Okay. If you think the Palestinians who spend their time throwing rocks at people, right? They know more about history and they have a better moral compass and they understand foreign policy better than we do and they understand American imperialism better than we. If you really want to say that, Robbie Martin, then go right ahead. But I'm going to say that me and my brother and my father and my sister and all the rest of my wife, we know a lot more than the Palestinians, okay? We've written books, they haven't. We know what America is, they don't. And they should listen to us.
Well, the other problem is to be able to put our faith in and trust in
I'm sorry, one last thing. If the Palestinians learn this, they could have as good a life as our blacks do.
God. Well, how can we trust that you will actually hold these morals and that we can actually look up to you and your fellow neocons as being trustworthy moral arbiters?
Because we have spent our entire lives writing articles and books and giving speeches and talks about this. Since we were in our 20s, we've been doing this consistently. This is us. This is who we are. To say that we have ulterior motives or that we're not actually invested in what we're saying, I think that's sort of insulting, frankly.
Well, you had to prove it to me. I mean, the society thinks you lie. You basically lied about the Iraq War. So, how do you? What's your response to that?
Okay, that's a good question. So
do you believe Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11?
So
like you said on camera.
Okay, we admit that was a bit of a fib. We admit that we weren't totally straight shooting with the whole Anthrax thing. But here's the thing: Saddam Hussein did in fact slaughter countless civilians. Okay, he sent his own army into this ridiculous war with Iran that killed 1 million of his own people, and he didn't care.
Were you working for the administration?
He gassed the Kurds. We know this.
Wait! Didn't you were working under the administration that brokered that?
The Reagan administration
and was backing the Iranian side.
The Iraq-Iran war you're talking about now?
Yeah,
under Reagan, Carter and Reagan. Was I? I don't know.
You were.
Well, I thought I was never in an administration.
You were in the Reagan administration, yeah.
Oh, but I had a very minor role, though, right?
Was
I calling the shots in the Iran-Iraq?
You were smart enough in your early 20s where you were plucked by Elliot Abrams for being so smart at sort of developing propaganda.
Oh, I forgot about that whole part of my career.
You worked for the Office of Information.
That was so long ago.
So you cut your teeth doing propaganda for the United States.
Exactly. So what happened was we had the Iraqis and the Iranians fight each other for a long time in one of the bloodiest wars in human history. And here's the great news. They killed 1 million of each other. So we got rid of a whole bunch of them. We decimated both armies without even landing one pair of boots on the ground. You're going to call that a failure?
So you want to make the argument that you're moral and just, but you're okay with letting two foreign countries obliterate each other.
We're talking about murderers, man. We kill murderers, don't we? We should kill murderers. During World War II, when Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and that was the worst war in human history, still is to this day, Harry Truman said, let's let them fight each other and kill as many of each side as possible. That's what he actually said. And, I think if you look back on it, that makes a lot of sense because we're talking about Stalin and Hitler, okay? Do you want Stalin and Hitler and Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi to have large armies, or do you want them to have smaller armies? Do you want them to have a lot of people on their side or fewer people on their side? These are really bad guys. And so I'm just saying, you got to...
Well, I mean, what do you have to say about the atoning for our own sins? Do you believe that interning the Japanese was a necessary step during World War II?
As a matter of fact, I don't know what Kagan would say, but we don't have to go down that road. No, once the United States entered the war, it made perfect sense, actually, to intern the Japanese. But that's another argument I will make elsewhere. I do hope this. I really hope that someday you do get to sit down with Robert Kagan and Bill Kristol for added measure, but I know you mostly want the Kagan. And I really, really appreciate your film because I've learned a lot about something I thought I knew a lot about, but I knew actually very little, it turns out. Especially in those crucial years around the Iraq War, I really didn't know what the neocons were doing and how they orchestrated so much of that. And I am very appreciative. I hope everybody watches this film. I hope it gets a huge audience. I hope that people start talking about foreign policy, not just the neocons, more and more, in part because of this film. But you're doing really good work. And I just want to say thank you for doing it.
Thank you for saying so. And thanks for taking an interest at all.
Yeah. What's next for you? Or you're going to finish this? You have one more part. You've released 3 parts.
I do.
You're working on the 4th.
Yeah, as you can see, standing up in my room right now is a chart where I'm trying to to sort of split up the different players. So yeah, part 4 of the film documentary series, it was originally going to be about Russia and Russiagate, but I feel like
please do. We need that.
Yeah, I mean the problem with doing a film just about that is the ending will just be absolving Trump of. I guess
you don't have to.
I want something a little bit more. I want to deliver a story to people that they don't already know. I want to go over a lot of things. Like Bill Kristol and Robert Kagan will still be in it. I want to show how they're sort of spinning their wheels. And I also want to show how the continuity that I believe exists between the Obama administration pulling back from these so-called foreign policy obligations to the Trump era, and show how there's sort of a Washington, D.C. consensus that turned against Obama and continued to stay in that adversarial position towards Trump and sort of remain in that position today.
Interesting. I look forward to it. I do think you should practice before you meet with Bob Kagan, but you're on the right track. And again, thank you for doing all this. And I just wish more people would pay attention to this stuff. It's so incredible that we're talking about life and death. We're talking about the lives and deaths of so many people, and yet so few Americans care at all or know anything about it.
I mean, I think that the only thing Americans will care about right now is if we do something on the level of the Iraq War again without us being attacked in any way. I think it'll take something on that level.
I was going to say the only thing that's going to get Americans to care is some catalyzing event like Pearl Harbor.
That's the scary part. We didn't really go into that too much, but I mean, if 9/11, almost 20 years ago now, I think we're sort of about due for another major attack. I mean, I don't see how the American empire will be able to continue to get support.
Sustain itself?
Yeah. I do have some optimism about that there does seem to be a decline in their ability to galvanize the American public to go to war, short of a new Pearl Harbor style event. So that's what scares me. And I think that 9/11 bought a lot of the people whose whole agendas the American empire, bought them a lot of time, I think. Mm-hmm. And I think that it was borrowed time, and I think that time is running out.
I hope you're wrong. I hope we don't have another event like that, although I wouldn't bet against it. I'm sorry to say. All right, man. Thank you for this again, and good luck. And everybody go watch A Heavy Agenda.
A very heavy agenda.
I'm sorry. It's a very heavy agenda. That's how good it is. It's a very good film by Robbie Martin. Thanks again.
Thank you, man.
This is the Unregistered Podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To support this show and become a member of the Unregistered community, go to unregisteredlisteners.com. Thank you for listening.